sure a few more people will join us, but let me go ahead and give you all a couple of housekeeping notes and introduce our speaker this morning. Thank you all for joining us. This is our third of 4 webinars with Carey Wallace. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can drop it into the chat. Her and I are monitoring it. We'll make sure those get to her and she gets those answered at the appropriate times. Unfortunately, the webinar today is not approved for CE, but we still have great information to share and I'm glad you all are here. Carey Wallace, again, is back with us today for our third of 4 webinars. If you missed the first 2 webinars, the replays are available on our YouTube channel, so go check that out. And we'll also include links to those in our summaries. Carey is the owner of AgencyFocus, a company she created to help independent agents understand their value and make informed decisions for their agency. Today, are you ready to secure the future of your agency? In this session, we'll dive into smart strategies for transitioning ownership, whether you're selling or passing it on, so you can maximize your agency's value and options when the time comes. Without further ado, Carey, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you for inviting me to do this series. I appreciate the time that everyone has spent, and it's great to see some people rejoining us again, so thanks for that. It's important for you guys to know that we work with a lot of agencies across the country, and about 65 to 70% of independent insurance agencies want to at least explore transitioning the ownership of their agency internally, which to me is a wonderful statistic. The key is starting early. So when someone wants to do this by having a plan that spans many, many years, it makes it very feasible in order to do an internal transition. It is unfortunate when some agents reach out and they want to transition internally and they only have a 3-year window or a 2-year window, or worse yet, even just a 1-year window. That makes it very, very difficult. So before I dive into a whole bunch of details and a whole bunch of things to think about, if you're thinking about transitioning internally, time is on your side. So the best starting point is to start having conversations. It is a marathon, not a sprint. But if you don't start the conversations is where typically that limits your options on being able to transition internally. One of the worst things I've ever seen happen is an agency has great internal candidates. The conversation is never broached. And then unfortunately, they either lose their internal transition or they think about it differently. It looks like Dana raised her hand. Dana, do you have a question? Okay. If you do, you can use it in the chat. I'll look at the chat to make sure that there's something in case. Okay. Anyway, so really starting that conversation gets things going and really allows you to not miss some opportunities. Where you start is incredibly important, but it does start with a conversation on both sides. So if you happen to be on this webinar and you're someone who aspires to be the future owner, starting that conversation with the current owner is also as critical as the owner communicating to their staff that they, in fact, are open to an internal transition. 70% of independent insurance agencies have a single owner. And the number one risk inside an independent insurance agency today is a single owner past the age of retirement without a plan. So it is the fastest way that an agency will sell at a discount when there is a single owner and a single life event causes that owner to not be able to run their agency. It's exacerbated when that owner is the top producer, has all the relationships, has all the key responsibilities like paying their staff, all of those things. So if those things are not diversified and those relationships are not spread among the agency, that the absence of that one person could cause your staff to become uncertain of their future and therefore potentially leave, your customers to become uncertain of the ongoing operation of the agency and potentially leave, your carriers to become uncertain on what's going to happen. That uncertainty caused by a single owner without a plan, and the delay that it takes in order to put a plan in place can actually cause an agency to sell at a discount faster than anything else. So if that is you, documenting what your plan is might be one of the most important things you would do for the succession of your agency. There's a study that's done at the national level that's called the Agency Universe Study, and the most recent one was done in 2022. And it basically reported that 89% of independent insurance agencies have some type of tool or plan in place for their agency. And it then lists what percentage of agents are thinking that they're going to transition internally to the next generation, to a current partner, potentially, sell a book back to a carrier, like whatever it is. It basically said 89% had an idea that internal was the way that they were going to go. From my data and the agents that I speak to on a day in, day out basis, there's roughly about 250 valuations we do a year. And we have roughly about 40 CFO, fractional CFO clients at this point in AgencyFocus. 93% of them have nothing in writing. So while they're saying people have an idea, in actuality, the ones that engage with us, 93% have absolutely nothing written down about their plan. Again, that could be the number one reason that agents sell at a discount, and it's an avoidable thing. So we're going to talk about why agents do not have a perpetuation plan in place. Number one, most agents thinks I don't need it until I'm ready to actually do it. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of thought. It's an uncomfortable thing to think about. Nobody in the world wants to think about what life is going to be like when they're not here. So therefore, it's pushed over to the side, and they're focused on working in their business, not necessarily planning for the future of their business. Another reason is they might not have great candidates. They might not know what they want to do in the future because right now in their current makeup or current staff, they've not identified someone that actually looks like a great candidate for them, or they're not ready to leave yet. But the biggest reason is fear. Like, it is hard. It's a big thing to think about. It's also very difficult to know where to take a bite in the apple in order to start this process. So I'm hoping by today, wherever you are in your process, we at least give you some tools and things to think about, as well as some things to ask yourself in order to make sure if an internal transition is something you're thinking about, fantastic. If internal is not what you're thinking about, some of these things are exactly what you need to do for any transition to make sure that you set yourself up for success. So again, the reason to have an internal plan is it mitigates the risk of a sudden unexpected event. That's one. So it's basically your disaster plan for the agency. But it also will allow you to set up the systematic transfer of both the stock or the money part of a transition of ownership, as well as the responsibility part of the transition. And those two things don't always happen at the same time. But if you have a systematic transition in place where while you're still there as an owner, you are mentoring the next owner and allowing them to take over responsibility with your support, those transitions go far better than someone who waits till the end, and then the staff abruptly is now looking at someone else that may have been their peer as now their leader. That it happens, but it's not the most smooth and best way in order to transition ownership. So it allows you to think about both sides of this transition. It also could allow you to attract and retain your best talent. If you put a pathway to ownership in clauses of the people that you're bringing on that could potentially be the future owners of the agency, it sets you apart as an agency. So being able to put that pathway in place, in my opinion, is one of the most underutilized things that we have available inside our inside our industry. It exists when you're lawyers. It exists when you're accountants. A pathway to ownership really can change the strength of your agency, whether you sell internally or externally. If you have people that have minority ownership and you eventually plan to sell externally, they win in that transition and they provide continuity to the next buyer. making your agency even more valuable than it would be if they weren't providing that continuity. So a pathway to ownership is not exclusive to an internal transition. That actually strengthens an external transition as well. And 100%, it solidifies that there is not a break in the continuity of your agency. Therefore, taking that one risk factor away that is the largest risk factor, and therefore will increase the value of your agency. So there's lots of reasons why you should have a plan. So number one, you have to think about what is most important to you as an owner. And oftentimes when I'm speaking in person, I put this up and ask people, what do you think is the number one thing that agency owners say is most important to them when they're thinking about the future of their agency? Not going to do that here and let you guys yell it out. That would be crazy. But the answer is their people. Typically, the number one answer that I get when someone calls me to get evaluation and I say, why are you getting evaluation? And they say, I'm planning for the future. What's most important to you is my people. I want to take care of the people that helped me build the business to get it where it is today. I want to take care of my customers in the way that they've been taken care of. And I want to get a fair price for my agency, typically in that order. Customers and staff are interchangeable in the order, but that's typically when I ask them what's most important, that is what they say. The one that is the most underestimated is if they're thinking about transitioning externally and they've been their own boss for 30 plus years, and they're thinking about selling externally and doing something called an earnout or working with the future owner for a period of time, working for someone else is the most underestimated thing about what matters most to an agency owner, because it's really difficult to end your career now working for someone else when you've been your own boss for a very long time. So it's something to think about, but there's lots of different things that are important. If you know what's most important to you, you then can frame all of the different opportunities in front of you against your priority list and be able to rank those opportunities appropriately. If you don't, it becomes almost like noise, and the person who calls you at the right time might actually be the one you choose when they're not the best fit for you. The questions you should consider is, what is my timing? Like, what's the ideal timing that I would like to transition ownership? And timing should contemplate that you want to always buy low and sell high. So as an agency owner, you do not want to wait until your energy level is at a point where your agency is no longer growing. That means you're actually going to sell low, not sell high. So think about the timing and what your ongoing involvement would be, whether or not you have time to mentor the person, build that in. If you wait until you're absolutely, I'm burnout and I'm ready to go, you won't have that time, and it won't be selling at a high and selling where you're setting everybody up for success. It might be more urgent. You also might have in your mind, I really want to sell to a partner or a key employee, whether it's an operational person or a producer or whomever. Talk to them. They might have no interest in being an owner. They have every interest in providing continuity, but they might not want the burden, financial burden, and responsibility of being an owner. So you need to have a conversation to find out, do they have the willingness and ability financially in order to be your successor? And then once you've identified someone, you know your timing, you know the time that makes sense for you to start this transition, you know that they are interested. You need to get a valuation to find out so you can tell them what is the financial impact that they're taking on, so they can actually start to plan for that. And also during that transition, as you exit and someone internally steps into the owner role, what are the hiring requirements in order to cover the full body of work of the agency? When I do evaluation, it's the valuation as the agency is today. But as you're doing your evaluation for a internal transaction, we have to contemplate the compensation of the exiting owner while they're phasing out, the compensation of the new owner as they're becoming the owner, and any kind of hiring that needs to backfill the gap between those two people's roles and make sure that the agency can continue to operate. So it really is an analysis in and of itself that's very unique to that agency to make sure that we have everything covered. And then sometimes when it's an internal transition, you do evaluation, you might discount it because of the contribution that person has made in order to get the agency where it is today. That is a very common approach to an internal transition. The reality is an internal transition is always at a lower price than what an external transition would be, simply because when you have two entities come together and one entity buys another, there's synergies between those two entities where their combined together profitability is higher typically than what they have separately. And that is because they might have combined contingencies that didn't exist individually. They might go from two locations to one. They would use the same tech system so they can eliminate some of their expenses in their overall systems that they use. There's elimination of insurance coverages, like all kinds of different eliminations of overlap when you bring two businesses together. For an internal, the only extra profitability is the exiting owner's compensation and benefits, and the difference between that and any hires that need to be made. So that profitability variable is much smaller in an internal transaction than it is in an external sale. So you have to know that as an owner, if that's what's most important to you, that is the reality between an internal and an external. The beautiful thing about an internal transaction is the price can be closer to an external if you can stretch it out over time. But if you are really condensed in the time, it'll be very, very difficult to close the gap or even get near closing the gap between internal and external if you don't have the gift of time. And in internal, there's also what's called an owner finance note. Typically, there's a portion that can be owner finance while the owner is still involved. And then there could be a bank loan once the owner is no longer involved. Like there's a lot of different structures for an internal that can make it more palatable and bring those prices closer together. But that gap between internal and external from a profitability standpoint is a very large gap, and it's something to think about. I would never deter someone from exploring internal. I think that it's amazing that we have such a large number of agents that want to give that opportunity to the next generation. But the reality is the difference between those two transactions are pretty significant. The second step is now you've asked yourself what's the most important. You know an idea of a timing of some people involved. Now you've got to get informed. You've got to get the fair market value of the agency so you have a realistic thought process of what your agency's worth from an internal standpoint. It'll also give you what are the benchmarks for other agencies your size and how could you maximize that value and set it up for success for the next generation or the next owner. It really allows you to identify your risk factors, minimize those risk factors as much as possible, and figure out a transition plan to ease those risk factors so the new owner has confidence that the agency can continue to operate the way that it has been, and also focus on those things that might cause a change in retention or a change in the performance of the agency, and you can work on it together during that transition time. But it's really important to take a look at your agency from an outside perspective and get this valuation. And it really can be a great catalyst of a conversation to the next generation so they can understand the health of the agency that they're buying and what the potential is going forward as well. So 100% is not just a number. It actually gives you a fair amount of information in order to start that planning process. From an agency's perspective, the valuation is made up of two numbers. It's made up of your operating profit or your EBITDA, as well as the market or the multiple that is determined by the market factors in order to get the value of the agency. That EBITDA number is 100% controlled by the decisions that the owner makes about staffing, infrastructure, line of business to go after, the profitability of the business that they go after, how they market, what technology they use, like all kinds of different decisions go into the EBITDA number. That market factor number or the multiple is really based on the risk inside the agency as well as what's happening in the marketplace. So what's crazy is we all spend time thinking about what the multiples are and less time on the thing that we can control, which is the profitability of the agency. Honestly, if I could get agents to think about that differently, maximizing that EBITDA number or that operating profit is where you can make such a huge difference in the options that you have for your agency, as well as set the next generation up for success. And what I mean by that is, if you've had a staffing situation inside your agency and you know you're overstaffed, or you know someone's compensation is not what it should be, waiting to solve that after you sell or have someone else solve that will give them the upside of making that decision versus you doing it in advance and being able to operate appropriately and profitably with the right staffing structure. Not making that decision can make a huge, huge impact on the overall value of the agency, whether it's internal or external. So knowing what goes into that number and what you can do to manage it is super, super important. To that end, when you go through evaluation process, we actually recast your profitability to what industry averages are or your own operating history has been. And oftentimes we'll make adjustments to your ongoing profitability based on, again, either industry averages or your own trends. The most common areas of adjustment are compensation, owner compensation being the largest adjustment. Lots of different strategies on how owners compensate themselves. We're going to put you closer to an industry average in order to make sure that we are accurately reflecting the ongoing profitability of the agency. That does not mean we're going to eliminate all of the owner's comp. We're going to right size it to an amount that the IRS would accept and allow part of it be the distributions of the agency, not all of it in W-2 or all of it in distributions. The second area is rent or occupancy expense. Many agency owners own their building and will pay themselves an inflated rent amount. That is something that's typically adjusted in evaluation. Travel and entertainment, contributions, things that you do inside your community might be discretionary type expenses that can be edited and removed and or the right sized to make sure that it fits with the ongoing, again, what the industry average is. And insurance is another area, automobile insurance, all of those things. We have to get the discretionary expenses really quantified and eliminated out of that P&L if they're not going to continue to get to what that true ongoing operating profit is for the agency. So let's talk about the difference between an internal sale and an external sale. So an internal sale, remember, that is when the only thing that changes is the person who's in ownership and the staffing that is caused to be different. An external sale, you might combine staff, you might combine locations. It will 100% depend on who the buyer is, what that profitability is, and what that combined profitability is, and what the ultimate price would be. So for an internal sale, the valuation that's based on your agency will be closer to a price for an internal sale than it ever would be for an external sale. The only time a valuation number would be close to an external sale is when those two entities really don't have a lot of synergies. There's no way to combine locations. They maybe don't have a huge overlap of books of business or carriers. They are located very, very far apart from each other. Ideally, that would not be your best buyer for an external sale because the synergies are low, but it can happen where you choose a buyer because culturally they're a fit, but there's not a lot of synergies, your price with that buyer might be closer to the internal valuation. But when you think about it, an internal valuation is really closer to what an internal sale would be, that fair market value, because it doesn't contemplate any kind of synergies between buyer and seller. Because it can't. We don't know who the buyers and sellers are. Step two, we're going to communicate. So we've actually got the information about the value of your agency today. Now we're going to start communicating who, what, when, where, and how to the people that make sense. We've already identified that there might be some internal candidates. They might be your partners. They could be your potential successors, some key employees. But we're going to start communicating to those people about what your wishes are. We're going to document exactly what that looks like and identify the people that would need to be notified if something happened, or those people or relationships that are critical to the ongoing performance and success of the agency. So if you've got key partners or referral partners or contacts, documenting who all those people are, if something should happen to you suddenly in one place, makes it very easy for someone to step in and actually be able to calm the fears that might occur if something happened to the owner. So for instance, we just wrote a perpetuation plan for an agency in North Carolina. He happens to have two very well-established niches. He has a staff with a couple key employees, and he's identified two agencies that would be the first people that would have the first right of refusal to buy his agency if something happens to him. If either of those agencies, both agencies can bid, they know that each agency is identified as a potential buyer. So he did that intentionally. So it's not just one buyer undercutting and offering a price that is low because they know they're the only person that has the ability. So both identified people will offer their best offer at the time, and his key employees are notified immediately that this is underway, that there is a plan in place, that these two owners or these two agencies have first right of refusal. Those key employees would reach out to their key referral partners and say, listen, something happens to the owner, we have it. They're very well known with those key referral partners and key niche partners, as well as the carriers. So it's not like they're having a stranger reach out to them right away. They will have the ability to reach out and ease the fear of those people as well. And then there's a list of people that they could contact. I'm their valuation expert. If they need that help during the transition, I would be available. Their lawyer's identified, the tax person's identified, the payroll provider is identified. So basically they have a list. If this happens, here's your responsibilities. And within a day, they can have all of those things notified where everyone's will be sad. Like, let's not forget the emotional side of this, but they will have comfort in knowing that there is a plan. It's been well thought out, and the owner is the person who made this plan. The last part is this agency identified two agencies that have similar culture, that they would have the first right of refusal to buy the agency. He didn't have internal candidates, but if either one of those agencies is not in a position to buy the agency at that point, one of them would be named to actually step in and run or oversee the agency while the agency is marketed for an external sale to an agent that we haven't identified. So there is a plan in place to say, listen, it's not gonna fall to my current staff. There's actually another agency owner that we've agreed on the compensation that he would get in order to help the family sell that agency externally. So there's no break in the continuity of running it. He did this because while his wife has done all of their bookkeeping, she has never run the agency. She's not managed the people. She's not licensed. So he's created a plan and identified the players and what they would need to do in a transition, and also not left it up to they're just dreaming about what might happen or might I work for someone else. They actually know the agency owners thought about it, because in reality, your staff is sitting there thinking to themselves, you're getting close to retirement. We don't know what your plan is. They might start thinking, if you're going to sell externally, I don't want to work for a big outfit. I like working for a small independent agent. I might leave because I don't know what your plan is. This alleviates some of that stress. So identify the players in an internal transaction and tell them what your plans are as much as you can. We all know that things might change, but you should view your perpetuation plan as a living, breathing document, not something that you do once and put away on a shelf. So it should be a conversation just to say, hey, listen, I've thought about the future. These are the things I'm thinking. And it might open the conversation to say, if you're interested, raise your hand now because we can figure that out. But if not, this is what the plan is for the agency. This is what it means for you all. Questions that current agency owners should ask themselves. This whole time I've been talking as if it's a single owner that owns the agency. But when there are partners involved, you have to consider what is the timing for all partners to want to transition out, and what would that do to an incoming owner that might have to buy out 3 partners all at the same time, or some partners that want to sell externally and some that want to transition internally. Like, you got to think that through and keep that line of communication up as well. Sometimes when there's multiple partners, you have to have agreement on who the candidates would be. Who are the viable candidates that would be considered for an internal transition? I've had this happen multiple times where 2 owners have children in the agency and they've not determined the criteria for that future generation to have ownership. And one's not super excited to be partnered with the others, and they've never talked about it. It creates conflict. So you have to talk about that well in advance. You have to talk about whether or not each owner is in a financial position to be ready to retire. There could be one that's well positioned, one that's not, and therefore it could change the timing on when those transitions are available. So open communication is a common theme here, and you've got to really make sure that you're having those conversations super early, because let's face it, a partnership is just like a marriage. Like, if you're not communicating, this can go sideways very, very quickly. I often joke that when I started doing valuation and perpetuation planning, I thought, oh, it would be amazing if I could have finance and legal in order to help people do this. But what I really need is finance and psychology in order to work through the real conversations that happen as you're planning for the future of the agency. I'm not saying legal wouldn't help, but we have plenty of lawyers that we actually use. So that eligibility, many times as you're building a perpetuation plan or a pathway to ownership for someone, they have multiple criteria that's put in place to say, if you want to be considered as a future owner of the agency, number one, there's performance metrics that you have to be with, that you have to hit inside the agency. If it's a producer, it might mean you have to grow your book to a certain amount. If it's an operational, you might have to contribute on the, staffing and staffing turn, or the profitability of the agency, the management of expenses, all of those things. Number two, you might have to have a time frame. You've got to work with the agency for 5 years before you're even considered to be in that role. You have to have an aptitude and temperament for leadership and leading a team. So there's tests that you can give to potential future owners. It's really important that you don't put someone in place that has no aptitude for actually leading people, which is a different skill set than building a book of business. And you got to make sure that you have it identified early. So if that person wants to go into ownership, they would never go into maybe the managing partner that would oversee the operations. Maybe they would just be a minority owner, and a contributing person as the person who is the salesperson. But remember, you have to think about, just because you want key people to be the future owners of your agency, if they're not willing to work together, arranged marriages don't work very well. I mean, 50% of marriages fall apart. Arranged marriages in an agency also don't work very well. There has to be really great communication, and they have to choose the partners they want. Actually, this agency owner I worked with, and she had her son-in-law and her daughter both working in the agency, and they were not married. So the daughter and her other daughter's husband were both inside the agency, and her thought process was, I'm going to gift them both ownership and they can be the future owners of the agency. We'll come to find out number one, her daughter didn't want to be an owner and didn't want the financial burden of being an owner. And she was, at a stage where she was growing her family and wasn't really thinking about ownership, where the son-in-law was ready to buy the whole agency right away. So those two people were not at the same point, but the exiting are really vision that they were going to be the future owners together. And they both came to her and said, this kind of feels like an arranged marriage. You can't do that. You've got to actually find out what they want. In that situation, the daughter has the option to buy in later when she's ready, not at the same time. They were actually accelerating it because the exiting owner was ready to exit, but she wasn't at a place yet to do that. So it really just, you have to facilitate the conversations and really think about it. If you're an incoming owner, what are the questions you should consider? Well, number one, there is a financial commitment to buying out an owner, and potentially you take a pay cut in order to do this. So are you willing to take on additional responsibilities? What is your ability to take on the financial responsibilities, and what's your willingness to take on some personal debt? Chris has a question about how does the second generation pay for the agency without setting them up to fail or bankrupting the agency? It's a super great question. It really, the next generation pays the current owner based on the profitability of the agency. So you literally look at the P&L and you come down to, here's the profit. And then we ask questions. How long will the current owner stay involved, and at what compensation amount and what responsibilities? As the future owner buys that agency, that exiting owner ideally would be waning down their responsibilities, creating some profit that they would be able to use to pay that owner. And when they transition completely out, that is where, if the future owners have bought, let's say 20% of the agency by using the current profitability of the agency and figuring out, if they have 20% of the ownership of the agency, they get 20% of the profit that they could then pay the agency for that amount. At the end, when they have 20% ownership, they can get a bank loan over a period of time as the exiting owner leaves and be able to buy out the additional 80%. When you use a bank loan, they will only loan you 90% of the value of the agency, number one, and they will only let you use 75% of the profit to service that debt. So you can't use all of the profit to pay the owner. So making sure that you have an internal candidate have ownership when they go to the bank, if they're going to use a bank loan, and also have the ability to have a loan for a period of time that will cash flow based on the structure of the agency. If the exiting owner stays too long and collects too much compensation, the internal buyers will not have enough profitability to pay him. Therefore, it makes it too difficult in order to do an internal and have the agency continue to operate and then be able to invest in the growth of the agency. So you can see time is really important to do it over time for an internal transition, way more important than what it would be if it's an external. So the most efficient length of time to pay the original owner over a 3 or 5 year period does an amount vary depending on the performance of the agency. It absolutely varies based on the performance of the agency and how well it's run and how profitable it is. Typically, paying the owner is somewhere between 7 and 10 years, not 3 and 5, because you have to stretch out. They only have 20% ownership or 50% ownership in the beginning, and their portion of the profitability has to be able to cover that. and still have 25% of the profits to be able to reinvest inside the agency. So it really is a math equation of how long that takes. And then once they get to the end to do the future buyout, again, the clock starts again for another 7-10 years to buy out the remaining portion. That is the best way to do an internal transition. And I'm not going to lie, there are some agencies that grow to a certain level where this time needs to be stretched out even further, again, to make sure that an internal transition will cash flow. But there's a lot of different assumptions you have to ask yourself. How long is the current owner going to be there? What's the future owner's compensation? What hiring needs to take place? And what are the key things that need to be transitioned as that exiting owner leaves to make sure that the performance of the agency stays the same during that transition? So it's all unique, but typically it is a longer transition for an internal simply because that profitability is only coming from the exiting owner and whether or not there's hires needed to make that transition happen. Yeah. Ideally, the transition for an internal should happen somewhere between at least 5 years in advance. But if you can give yourself 10 years, even more. But this varies based on size. So for $1 million agency in revenue, we say 5 years in advance is plenty. If it's 2 million, 3 million, we're talking about probably 5 to 7 or 7 to 10 to buy a portion and then have the second portion done in a 10-year period also as well. So it really depends on the performance and the size of the agency and that multiple. And if the agency is profitable, you've got way more options. If the agency is not being operated profitably, you can't expect the agency to pay you and also get paid for the agency at the same time while you're there. Okay, transition topics. The things you need to discuss are who's going to lead the agency. How are you going to transition the customer relationships? How are you going to transition your carrier relationship? And what communication plan do you need for the internal staff, for your referral partners, for your key customers? Like, you need to be thoughtful about that. It can't just be, we're making this happen, and the next thing you know, someone else is leading the sales team. You have to think about what's the communication and how do you step into those things. Oftentimes there is a niche inside a book where a portion of the customers take some real thought in transitioning those relationships over time. I strongly suggest doing like a red, yellow, green to your customers and saying the reds are the ones that we think would be at risk if there was a transition of ownership, and make the plan for those customers very specific to who they are. Same thing with your carrier relationships. There could be some carriers that would get very squeamish about the ownership transition, especially in this hard market. You got to know who those are and make sure that you have time to introduce those new individuals in there so we don't disrupt that relationship. But those are some transition topics you should think about. Things that potential owners should do. You should absolutely communicate that you want to take ownership. Number 2, learn about the agency. Ask to look at the financials. Understand what it takes in order to run the agency from a personal level, from a professional level. Seek out advice of other new owners, what it was like. Don't think that the current owner has all the answers, because it's an emotional thing for them to leave an agency that they started. Surround yourself with other people that can give you advice. Honestly, go to a bank and see if you have the credit rating in order to even qualify for a loan far in advance of even wanting to. Like, talk to a lender that understands independent insurance agencies. And really think about your own timing. Like, if you want to own the agency by the time you're 35 or 40 and it doesn't match up with the timing of the owner, have a conversation about it. Like, you've got to be proactive and not just wait. I think both sides waiting are what causes the most problems. So think about that, but also learn about leading people. Like, if you're a single contributor today, educate yourself about what it takes to lead people. It's a different skill set. Like, take initiative, ask to be mentored, ask to take on projects that will allow you to step into that role slowly rather than overnight. But it's really, really important to show initiative, because it's a difficult decision and there's no two ways around that. And they also need to feel very confident that you are the right person to transition to. So those are things that you should be thinking about. Should also build your team. You should know who the lawyer is that you would use, who an accountant is. You should be talking to them far in advance. You should have someone who understands your agency and can give you a true value, could do the modeling for this. Like, that is what my team does all the time. So make sure you have someone who has experience that you don't have. You get to sell your agency one time. That typically you do not do it more than once. So make sure you surround yourself with people that you know can actually help you in this process, and don't try and teach somebody that's never done it before. We already talked about the fair market value versus the price. The price is actually what's fair to both parties as we do that analysis, especially in an internal. The fair market value gives you an idea or a range, but the actual price will be dictated based on all those assumptions that Chris was asking about, like, what's the timing of the exiting owner? What's the hiring needs in order to cover? All of those things will actually determine what that price is. How long is the mechanism of payout will help determine the price, because basically the combination of price, mechanism, and time will actually tell you what will this cash flow in the structure we're talking about. So if you have your head set on a time, then the price and the mechanism will have to be adjusted. If you have your head set that I have to get this price, well, you might have to stretch out the time and use a different kind of mechanism. But those three things work together. So if you really ask yourself, what's the timing? What's my ongoing involvement? Make sure that you ask and know what the willingness is of the people you have in mind, and are thinking about the timing and expectations of your partners. You'll be able to formulate this plan. If you don't, and you're not thinking about this, and something comes up upon you, you will not have as many options available to you that you would had you considered all of these things. So again, these three things work together. They are not in isolation of each other. And so, for instance, if someone wants to get paid all up front, then they might have to take a lower price because they're dictating what that mechanism and the time is. And so there's only so much that an agency, future agency owner can do to give you all cash up front. So if that's what's most important to you, you might have to give on the price. Not only that, you're putting all the risk on the buyer if you ask for all cash up front. If you're willing to take payments over time, then it allows that to be spread out and it to be managed in a different way, where you have a different mechanism or different loan structure. Therefore, a longer time, the price could be higher. So you really have to understand what's most important to you in your situation, and is it possible, and is it a win for the future buyer, for the agency, and the exiting owner? It can't just be a win for one side. It's got to be a win-win-win, or it won't cash flow and you'll be renegotiating those terms. That's the other thing I will tell you. Internal transactions, oftentimes they are, I want a certain amount for my agency, and that's what I'm going to require. And they don't talk to a lender. They don't talk to a valuation person. They say, my friend had the same size agency. This is what they sold it for. I want to get that from my internal. That is the number one reason that loans or internal structures have to be renegotiated, which makes Thanksgiving dinner really, really tough. So get outside help. And don't think just because the same agency across town that was the same size sold for a certain price that that's your price. Their situation could be far different, and you cannot think about it the same way. Getting that contingency buy sell in place early will again mitigate some risk. Now the players know that they have the terms set, the time set, what they need to do to prepare for it. Everybody's on the same page. So typically a contingency buy sell says this person has the option to buy this agency using this mechanism. Fair market value is the best thing that you can use for the valuation thing, in these triggering events. So upon my death, they have the first right of refusal to take over the agency and buy the agency this way. That is the easiest one because typically life insurance is in play, and the exiting or the deceased owner could be paid based on those funds. The hardest one is disability, determining that an agency owner is uncertain whether or not they'll be able to come back. What happens? When is the triggering event where the future owner can step in and take over? Having a perpetuation plan in place that clearly states this really alleviates a lot of stress, because the reality is disability is far more likely than death, and it can cripple an agency pretty quickly. So think about the triggering events. What will determine when we're able to execute the buy-sell agreement, how it will be executed, how it will be paid. We need to make sure that it will not hurt the ongoing operation of the agency. And not all of them are payments up front. They might be payment over time, especially if there's a disability. If there's a divorce and there's a husband and wife that own the agency, or their partners or whatever, that has to be a clause in many family owned agencies. Make sure you think about it before it's upon you. So, and then what happens when there's a normal, regular retirement? Then you need to think about what are the funding sources available in order to pay for this transition? What's the cash and investments that are inside the agency? The life insurance or the key man insurance that exists. The disability coverage is huge when there's a disability of the owner, as well as whether or not the agency has a line of credit. And then we've talked a little bit about owner held notes versus bank loans. Any owner held note follow what a bank loan would do other than the interest rate. So please, Lord, do not put a loan in place that takes all of the profitability of the agency and does not allow for the unknowns, because there are many unknowns. Nobody predicted COVID. Like, nobody under the sun said that that was going to happen. I don't know that anyone thought that the hard market would last as long and maybe be here for, this period of time. I don't know that there was no prediction at all, but certainly not for the length of time. So nobody knew about the Great Resignation and the movement towards remote work and how big impact it would have on independent agents. So making sure that the person can continue to operate the agency and invest in that agency is so incredibly important. And then think about what they would need to know. We talked about the people they'd need to notify, but can they get to the information they need to operate the agency if something happened to you tomorrow? You should use something like LastPass or whatever your password protection is and have a file. This is the information you would need. It has all of the places, the logins, all of the people that you contact, all of the passwords that are needed, who has the key functions. Document the processes so someone can pick up and actually do the things that you're doing. Who are the contacts at the carriers, your banks, your advisors? I had one agency that had 3 owners and they thought their risk was very, very low. And I used to joke with them like, hey, we need to get your valuation done for, eventually you guys are going to want to transition. And they would laugh or whatever. And we never did it. And on a Saturday morning, one of my phone rang and one of them called me, and I answered the phone because they were super good friends of mine, known them forever. I was joking with him and basically said, hey, you ready for that valuation? And his voice cracked. The younger of the 3 agency owners had passed away Friday night from a massive heart attack. And that agency owner was the one that did all the payroll and the commission reconciliation. The other 2 owners were sales. Like one did all the commercial sales, one did all the benefits and personal line sales, and they covered the team. They were in a panic because they knew that this agency was going to sell externally in about 3 years when those 2 were ready to retire. They were the older of the 2, but the younger one passed away suddenly, and they knew they were going to have to pay his widow an internal number, obviously because he died and they had never valued the agency. And luckily, she was familiar with his involvement at the association and trusted that we could value her agency for her. Had they not, it would have gone into a pretty serious situation. we also put in that agreement that when they sold externally, she would get the differential of his portion of the agency upon that sale. But had they not reached out and had they planned, it would have been less stressful, and I wouldn't have been a phone call on a Saturday morning when they're mourning their friend. It created a lot of extra stress. They didn't have logins to pay their people. They truly didn't even know who the payroll provider was, which is not great, but that's the reality when you really don't have cross training inside your agency. So make sure the people that are left behind know where to find this information and they're not searching for it. Common mistakes. Number one, you wait too long. You have an unrealistic price. You don't communicate. There's unrealistic expectations on both sides, and you're not willing to invest in the expertise, and you try and go it alone and you have to renegotiate that deal. 100% of the time, if you plan, you're going to give yourself way more options. I'm going to pause. If you have questions and you want to talk about this, I'm happy to. I know we're right at time. This is a lot to cover. I actually do this typically in a 3-hour session as well, because there's so many things to think about. But if there's a question you have, I would love to answer it. I will also tell you that everyone in Louisiana, I mean, we're a partner of Louisiana. So if you want to talk specifically about your agency and you don't want to share a question here, we do 30-minute free sessions for anybody that wants to just ask questions, talk about anything. You can use my QR code and book a time. We actually have a downloadable perpetuation planning document on our website that you can find there. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we do a podcast where we talk about these stories where you can learn for other agencies. It's called Insurance Refocus that I get to do with my daughter. So tune into any of those things. Hopefully it's helpful for you all.
Thank you so much, Carey.
You're welcome.
Wow, that was a lot of great information. Thank you for sharing that. I have a few of y'all on here who have probably tuned in for all 3 that we've had so far, and I think it's a testament to the knowledge and that Carey brings to our industry and everything else. So thank you so much. You have one more chance to hear from her this year with us. Our next and last webinar was rescheduled because of Hurricane Francine. It will be October 3rd at 10 a.m. I will send you all a link for that. It will be redefining your team, and it's going to focus on VAs, bots, and automation. You do not want to miss that one. It is approved for continuing education, so you can get 1 hour free with us next week. If you registered for the original webinar in September, your registration does automatically roll over, so you don't need to register again, but tell all of your friends to sign up and do that. Also, before we go, I would be remiss not to shamelessly plug our first ever Insure and Sizzle cook-off that's coming up November 7th in Scott, Louisiana, just outside Lafayette. We already have 12 teams that have committed to cooking. So if you want to enter a team, go ahead and enter. If you want to eat, kind of like me, and just sample all of the great food that's going to be there, we're going to have a party that night after everyone cooks. So come out and enjoy. I'll include a link to that in our follow-up email. If you have any other questions, please let us know. We'll be on for another minute or so, but we appreciate you, Carey, taking time and sharing all of this great information. And we're going to see you all again next week.
I'm just sad I'm not going to be able to have any of that food. Like, that's
Come on.
A little unfair to tell somebody that is in South Carolina that you guys are having amazing food. That's just not fair.
You can come. You are welcome to come. You can come bunk up with us and join us. Oh, thank you, Johnny. Johnny said fantastic info. Can't wait to be in touch with you.
Awesome. All righty. Well, thanks for having me. I'll see you soon, okay? Oh,
thank you, Carey.
Share my
Appreciate
website again. Sure. Hang on, I'm going to put this back up.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Oh, and I should probably also mention Carey and her daughter Lindsay are coming to the Women in Insurance Conference, and are going to be speaking at that. So you don't want to miss that either.
Yeah, good.
We'll include that website in our summary email as well. So
awesome. All right, Kathleen, thank you so very much. I'll see you guys soon, okay?
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.